They say history is written by the victors, but what about the voices that were silenced before they ever touched ink? Buried beneath the triumphs of empires and the pride of rulers lies another story, one historians rarely dared to record. It is a story of chains not made of iron alone but of skin, color, and blood. A story erased, hidden, and feared, because to remember it would be to confront the darkest truth of humanity. These were not the chains of conquerors parading their captives in glory, nor the celebrated shackles of prisoners of war who later became martyrs. No, these were the forgotten chains, the ones placed on those deemed less than human. Chains born not of strategy or conquest, but of prejudice, silent tools of control, forged in hatred, tightened by indifference and disguised beneath the proud banners of civilization. When we open the pages of history, the empires appear grand. The columns of Rome, the palaces of the Ottomans, the marble courts of Europe, they glitter like jewels. But hidden in their shadows was a different foundation, the sweat, suffering, and blood of those enslaved for their race, their skin, their difference. The victors never wanted this part of the story written. To admit it would mean admitting that their greatness stood on the broken backs of the forgotten. And so the silence began. In classrooms, victories were celebrated, but the cries of the oppressed were muted. In chronicles, rulers' achievements were preserved, but the endless humiliation of those beneath them was omitted. Yet silence does not erase the truth. Every chain leaves a mark, and those marks remain in the ruins, in the whispered folk tales, and in the echoes of injustice that still live on today. The forgotten chains were not only physical, they were mental, social, and generational. Stripped identities, forbidden languages, erased cultures, entire peoples reduced to shadows, their names replaced with numbers, their dignity stolen in the open, while the world looked away. This was not an accident. It was deliberate, a design to ensure that their suffering would never rise to threaten the pride of their masters. But what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? What happens when the scars begin to speak louder than the monuments, and when the chains once hidden in silence start to rattle in the conscience of a new world? This is not just history. This is a warning. For the forgotten chains no historian dared to mention are not only relics of the past, they are mirrors reflecting the dangers of forgetting. And today, as we peel back the shadows, you will see what they never wanted you to see. The brutal reality of racism, oppression, and injustice that shaped empires, destroyed lives and left scars still bleeding centuries later. When the dust of forgotten centuries settles over the ruins of empires, what remains are not just broken stones, but the whispers of lives that were never meant to be remembered. Among those whispers lies a hidden chapter, one soaked in humiliation, cruelty, and silence. It is here, buried deep beneath the grand histories of emperors and conquerors, that we uncover the fate of the enslaved. They were not merely possessions, but bodies turned into battlegrounds, their suffering woven into the foundations of civilization itself. The world of the oppressed was not recorded by scribes or honored by monuments. Instead, it lingered in shadows, half-erased accounts, fragmented testimonies, and artifacts that seem ordinary until one realizes the horrors they once represented. Imagine a city of shining marble, filled with wealth and spectacle, its streets echoing with triumph. Behind its facades, however, existed a darker, unlit world. In kitchens beneath palaces, in the damp corners of markets, and within the locked chambers of wealthy estates, countless victims endured fates worse than execution. For them, survival was not freedom, it was submission. Their bodies became tools of power, their voices drowned beneath the roar of history's victors. If you think chains were only iron, you are mistaken. The most brutal chains were unseen, laws, customs, and unwritten codes that allowed the degradation of one human being by another. This was not just a story of conquest. It was a story of what happens when cruelty is normalized, when oppression is not questioned but celebrated. In this forgotten world, a single glance could seal one's fate. A refusal, a hesitation, even a breath out of place. Each could unleash punishment so calculated that death itself seemed merciful. Yet the silence remained. The victims did not speak, for to speak was to invite greater pain. Generations carried these scars, never recorded in official chronicles but etched in memory like invisible ink across time. What is most unsettling is not only the brutality, but how ordinary it all was. To the rulers and the powerful, suffering was entertainment, domination was a right, and mercy was weakness. They did not see people. They saw property, vessels to command, objects to bend until nothing of the human spirit remained. Every act of cruelty was justified, wrapped in the language of law and custom, until even the vilest punishments became routine. And yet within this silence, fragments of truth survived. In rare inscriptions, in accounts whispered by travelers, in the writings of philosophers who dared to question the order of things, we find glimpses of lives shattered by systems designed to erase them. These fragments tell us more than any triumphal arch or marble statue ever could. They reveal the true cost of empire, the blood that greased its wheels, and the forgotten souls who paid its price. The story you are about to witness does not belong to emperors, generals, or kings. It belongs to those who never had the chance to write their own histories. This is the tale of how ordinary cruelty became law, how silence became survival, and how an entire people's suffering was carefully buried beneath the myths of glory. And now, after centuries of silence, their voices return, not through celebration but through revelation. Their truths, once forbidden, now stand against the glittering illusions of empire. What follows is not a legend. It is the record of what power does when unchecked, what society becomes when cruelty is normal, and what history erases when it fears the truth. Beneath the splendor of empire, the lives of the enslaved unfolded in silence. Their day began before the sun's first light, in quarters where the air was thick with dampness and despair. There were no beds, only straw mats, no warmth, only the faint heat of bodies pressed together. The city above bustled with wealth and pride, but here survival was the only ritual. To be born into slavery meant to inherit chains before one's first breath. Families were torn apart without hesitation, children ripped from mothers and sold like livestock. There was no identity, no lineage, only ownership. The names given were not their own, but imposed by masters who saw them as possessions rather than people. Every task, every movement was dictated by command. The women bore the heaviest burdens. They were forced to serve not only with their hands, but with their bodies, their dignity erased as though it had never existed. A refusal, however small, could mean flogging, starvation, or worse. The cruelty was not hidden. It was performed openly, a reminder to all that resistance was futile. And still, even under this weight, fragments of humanity endured. Silent glances exchanged in passing, stolen moments of kindness when no one was watching. The markets were perhaps the most chilling scene. Rows of men and women stood displayed for purchase, stripped of clothes, stripped of hope. Buyers inspected teeth, muscles, even scars, as if appraising animals. Bargains were struck with casual indifference, deciding the fate of a life with the same ease as buying grain or cattle. For many, this was where existence began, and where dreams ended. What made the horror worse was the normalization. To citizens, it was simply the order of the world. Slaves cooked their meals, raised their children, built their temples, and suffered in silence. They were everywhere, yet unseen, essential to the empire's greatness, yet denied its humanity. This was the paradox of civilization. Its marvels rose on foundations of cruelty. Every stone laid in the city, every banquet held in a noble's villa, carried with it the hidden cost of human suffering. And as centuries passed, the cruelty hardened into custom, until it was no longer questioned at all. Control in the empire was never maintained by kindness. It was fear that kept the enslaved silent, fear that turned resistance into a distant thought, fear that carved itself into the bones of those who endured it. Punishment was not only a response, it was a performance designed to remind every soul of their place. The whip was the most common instrument, its crack echoing through courtyards and kitchens. A single lash tore skin open, but punishments rarely stopped at one. Dozens of strokes were delivered until the body collapsed, trembling and broken. These displays were often public, a cruel spectacle to teach others that pain was the cost of defiance. But there were punishments worse than the whip. Starvation was a favored tool, leaving a person alive but hollow, their strength withering day by day. Others were branded with hot iron, their flesh permanently marked to show ownership, living reminders that they were property. Some were locked in chains for days, wrists and ankles rubbed raw until infection spread. The cruelty did not end with physical torment. Humiliation was as sharp a weapon as any blade. Women were paraded before crowds, stripped of dignity to break their spirit. Men were forced to perform degrading tasks in front of their peers, their humiliation serving as entertainment for those in power. Each act stripped away not just the body but the soul. Silence became the shield of survival. Those who saw a companion beaten, burned, or humiliated dared not intervene. To speak was to invite the same fate. Fear spread like fire, consuming any thought of rebellion before it could ignite. Masters understood this well. Their cruelty was calculated, not chaotic. Every punishment was a warning. And so an invisible law was written, not in ink but in pain. It told the enslaved that mercy was a myth, that suffering was inevitable, that hope itself was dangerous. It whispered that survival was found not in resistance, but in submission. And the longer it endured, the more it became accepted, not just by the oppressors but by the victims themselves. This is the true horror, when cruelty ceases to shock, when brutality becomes normal. For the Empire, this normalization was the greatest victory of all. It allowed the powerful to continue their rule unchallenged, and it erased the humanity of those beneath them until history itself forgot their voices. Beneath the marble temples and triumphal arches, silence carried its own weight. The enslaved moved like shadows, present everywhere, acknowledged nowhere. Their hands built the walls, cooked the meals, raised the children of their masters, yet their own names dissolved into dust. To the world above they were invisible, existing only to serve. Control was not only enforced by chains and whips, it lived in the small details of daily life. Permission was needed to eat, to sleep, even to breathe freely. Every gesture reminded them of their lack of autonomy. A meal could be withheld as easily as a word. A life could be ended with no consequence. For women, the torment was doubled. They carried the weight of labor and the burden of exploitation. Their bodies claimed without consent, their voices silenced before they could rise. For men, strength was twisted into servitude, their skills stolen to build the empire while their identities were erased. And yet the cruelty remained hidden from the larger world. Citizens strolled through markets, praised their leaders, and admired their city, blind to the human cost that sustained it. The system worked not because it was questioned, but because it was accepted. Brutality became background noise, the silent heartbeat of empire. The empire stood tall, glittering with triumph, but its brilliance was built on bones. For those enslaved, every day was a silent battle for survival. Every breath a reminder of chains both seen and unseen. Their suffering was not an accident of history, it was the foundation of it. And yet history chose silence. It celebrated emperors, wars, and monuments, while burying the truth of those who made them possible. But silence does not last forever. Beneath the ruins, the voices of the forgotten stir, ready to rise and expose the darkness that empires tried to erase. Fear had done its work, silencing countless voices. But silence is never eternal. Beneath the crushing weight of cruelty, fragments of defiance began to flicker. Whispers turned into stolen glances into secret acts of resistance. Each small spark carried the risk of unimaginable punishment, yet the oppressed knew that endurance without hope was a slower kind of death. The empire believed it had erased humanity from its victims, but in truth it had only buried it deeper. Now that buried fire stirred, threatening to ignite in ways the masters could never imagine. The empire believed it was eternal. Its walls stretched high, its armies unmatched, its rulers convinced that power carved into stone could never crumble. But stone does not bleed, people do, and it was in the silence of the enslaved that the first cracks began to form. What began as whispers became a rhythm, a hidden pulse beneath the noise of grandeur. Small acts of defiance carried weight far beyond their size. A tool broken on purpose, a meal portion stolen, a message passed in darkness. To the masters these seemed insignificant, mere accidents of daily life. But to those in chains, each act was a victory, a reminder that their spirit had not been extinguished. The punishments grew harsher. Whips cracked louder, shackles tightened, executions were staged as lessons. Yet the very cruelty meant to silence only deepened the will to resist. When one fell, others carried the memory forward, transforming suffering into fuel. The empire had relied on fear for centuries, but fear is fragile and once broken, it never returns with the same strength. One night in a villa that glittered with wealth, the illusion shattered. A group of enslaved workers, long beaten and humiliated, struck back. It was not an organized revolt, not an army, just desperate souls with nothing left to lose. Their actions echoed far beyond that villa's walls. Whispers turned to stories, stories to rumors, rumors to warnings that traveled faster than chains could contain. The rulers dismissed it at first. They had crushed rebellions before, silenced voices with fire and sword. But this time the defiance was different. It was not just a fight for freedom. It was a fight for memory, a refusal to let suffering remain invisible any longer. Each act of rebellion carried the unspoken message: we were here, we endured, and we will not be forgotten. In that moment, the Empire's greatest illusion, control, was broken. The enslaved were no longer shadows, no longer silent instruments of labor. They had become the very force that would expose the Empire's darkest truth. And once that truth was spoken, no monument, no law, no army could erase it. When the dust of rebellion settled, the Empire still stood, but it was forever changed. Its monuments gleamed, yet beneath them lay the truths it had tried to erase. The enslaved, once silenced, had carved their memory into history through defiance and sacrifice. Their pain became a warning across centuries. No power, no wealth, no empire can last when built upon forgotten suffering. What remains today is not the triumph of rulers, but the resilience of those they tried to destroy. And so the final question lingers: if silence hides cruelty, who among us will dare to break it?